Via the technology of Skype and webcams, I have on the line Canon Kendall Harmon from South Carolina, and we're using this opportunity to talk about 9/11. And in speaking with you briefly the last couple of days, I've discovered you have a unique, different, and very fascinating critique of before, during, and after 9/11. I want to get this on tape in interview format just to share with people. Um, let's start with what's your take on 9/11?
Well, in a sense, I'm arguing from absence.
Okay.
I think that the big thing that struck me from the moment it happened was, where is the judgment of God on this country in the midst of all this? And I didn't see people asking that question.
Right.
And I found myself thinking of something like the Lisbon earthquake, one of the biggest events in European history in the sort of pre-modern, nearly modern era. And, everybody was asking about the judgment of God and maybe what they did wrong to get God mad at them in that kind of a situation. But there are lots of questions being asked about the country, but I didn't see anybody asking if God was possibly in the event itself, in the sense of calling into question us as a country and where our priorities and focus
Well,
was.
one of the strange things is we became victims that day, and I
Yes,
think that automatically put blinders on to the question you're asking.
right, and it's not that the fact that we were victims was untrue, or that it was a tragic event, but I think you have to look at events like that from many different vantage points, and I really think that there was a call to significant national repentance, would be the way that I would put it, in and through that event, that the Lord might have been looking for. I mean, I want to couch my language carefully, because when you talk like this, you always have to use tentative language. You don't make automatic connections about what God is doing in the world, because it's only seen much more clearly in retrospect. But
Well,
I think the right way to
we don't
look
want to
at
see the headline next week, Living Church.
right.
Kendall Harmon says 9/11 was God's wrath upon America.
Well, it right. I, like I said, I would say a lost opportunity to ask the question whether God's judgment was working in and through the event, to
Okay.
call things we were about into question, and I didn't see that happening, and like a lot of people, I try to think of vantage points or people who could come into the situation and ask hard questions. And the person I thought of was David Halberstam, because he not so long ago died and was a great writer and historian. But I thought of his book, The 50s, and the reason I thought of Halberstam and the 50s is because the 50s is really about the 60s. And the seeds of the 60s, Halberstam argues, in the 50s, are all sown in the previous decade, and that's what he shows in that book. And I think if you look back into the 80s, and especially the 90s, a lot of the seeds of the questionable practices and focuses of the country were sown there. And what I saw was a lot of superficiality, a lot of focus on affluenza and prosperity and materialism and things that are fleeting, a lot of assumptions that began to be built in about what was realistic. I think a lot of us have missed reflecting on how many assumptions got sent wildly out of whack as a result of what was happening in the 80s and the 90s.
Well, you're talking about the yuppie generation,
Well,
the material girl,
yeah, and I'm talking about the fact that as that is going on, the country is asleep to a danger which is going around the world, which has direct implications on it. But that in a sense is a metaphor for a deeper sleepness, which is a kind of a personal and a spiritual asleepness and lethargy for us as a country, in terms of, are we focusing on the things that last, and are we sacrificing for things that really matter? And one of the events that I think about is something like Pearl Harbor, the movie, which was big in the 90s, even though it was kind of a schmaltzy and not that great of a movie. But one of the reasons it was so popular when it was out is because there was an overriding sense of a loss of something that was going on underneath the surface. And when you watch Pearl Harbor, you saw in America where there was a common purpose. It was about something that really mattered. People really had to make sacrifices. They had to decide between something that was important and something that was less important. And the thing that was less important was really very important, but sometimes you have to make really difficult decisions. And in the case of that generation, many of them gave up their lives. And there was this nostalgia for a time of unifying national purpose, which would be a great thing. And I think that could have come out of 9/11, or at least one would have hoped that a great country that seized on a great opportunity would have enabled that to take place, but it didn't. And that worried me. And the other thing that I saw looking back, and I think Halverson would have pointed out, is there was an increasing distance between the elites and the common purpose, the common person, and a great trust in the elite's ability to manage and get things right. I mean, I don't know if you remember the Time magazine cover, the Committee to Save the World. Mm-hmm. You know, and you have Robert Rubin and Alan Greenspan, and Larry Summers, and it's just, I mean, the Committee to Save the World, and it's this elite group of people educated at these elite schools who have these great theories, and who push the right button and pull the right lever. And it's onwards and upwards. You know, every day in every way we're getting better and better, as the French philosopher Coué once said, which is sort of a very sophisticated Norman Vincent Peale-like way of thinking. And that all really ground to a halt. So we have this event, and we have this event which calls into question these things that were happening before the event. And there's a tremendous time, which is a very short time, where the country really comes together, and instead of asking hard questions and really seizing great opportunities, what do we get? We get, I think most memorably to me, when President Bush, this is George Bush, Bush 2 now, says, go shopping. I mean, he's trying to tell us to get back to normal, but that's the thing I think that scares me the most about 9/11 is the degree to which the country, in so many ways that matter, reverted to the mean in terms of the things that were wrong, or I would want to call into question at least, about the 80s and 90s once we get to the post 9/11 world. And now you got Greenspan, who was on the cover of Time, solving the problem of a technology and internet bubble by creating a housing bubble of unprecedented proportions. And then to solve the housing bubble, which was a total disaster, we create a credit bubble. So we've now had a triple bubble, which is just an unimaginably huge expansion of credit, the likes of which the world has maybe never seen, but certainly rarely seen, and it's now popped, and we've got this national hangover. And one of the reasons that it happened was because we had our focus in the wrong place. But another reason that it happened is we had the trust in these elites who always made the right decision. And look at Greenspan. I mean, soon after 9/11, he's up on the Hill testifying before Congress. And if you remember the kind of atmosphere, I mean, he's treated like a demigod. I mean, he's like the Oracle of Delphi. Everybody's sort of, I mean, he always knew the right thing to do. He's the guy that navigated through all of the difficult, parts of the river where things really changed and it got really rocky. And so that he was almost treated with awe and reverence. And yet, what was his way of dealing with it is to make it in lots of ways worse. And you juxtapose that Alan Greenspan with the Alan Greenspan who went back not that long ago and was treated very differently by Congress post-bubble. Now that we're in the midst of this ongoing national hangover, which isn't even close to finished yet. And he says to them, what does he say? He says, my assumptions were wrong. And see, that's what I mean by a lost opportunity. I mean, that's the most that the elite can say. What in the world are we doing? There's more than just assumptions that need to be called into question. This isn't about a couple of pieces of data on a graph that were wrong. The whole way that he went about it was wrong.
No, he took the value out of everything. When you don't allow bankruptcies from major corporations, they no longer, you can't assign a value to it.
Well, and when people talk about the new normal now, what worries me is what normal became through that experience of those three bubbles in a row was completely out of touch with reality. I mean, there was an analyst that wrote Dow 36,000. Mm-hmm. in the Wall Street Journal op-ed page at one point, and nobody said anything. This is the kind of thing that you can sort of doubt that trees grow to the sky kind of thing. And but the reason it got like that is because we got so out of touch with reality, and that was post 9/11. And look at the state budgets, look at the local budgets, and look at the disaster that they are, and why? Because they saw the revenue that was coming in as normal and attached all sorts of expenses to that revenue, whereas they were in an unprecedented historical time where everything was already wildly out of whack before, and then it got even more out of whack.
Exactly.
And so you have budgets that were attached to numbers that were ridiculously out of touch. And see, those are the consequences of failing to seize the opportunity, and also the elites not calling into question not simply their assumptions but themselves. And I still see that happening. And I see that happening with the current Federal Reserve. I see that happening with those currently involved in government. I find myself thinking of Peter Kreeft from time to time, who said to me once, he said, if I could only have one motto in my life, it would be never trust the experts.
Okay, so we've proven that an MBA from Harvard is worthless. Where are we going to go from here?
Well, you mean now?
Well, you've taken us through the 50s, and you've proven that there's causation from the generation or the decade before, and not that we're serving penance for the 80s or 90s, but there is a certain causation.
Well, I think if we would have served penance for the 80s and 90s in a good way post 9/11, we wouldn't be where we are.
Right.
But now we've got to serve penance not just for the 80s and the 90s, but for the incorrect response to the 80s and 90s. I'm not sure that we've even resolved that the response has been incorrect. I mean, the Federal Reserve's doing quantitative easing. We've got Keynesian economics being proposed by the current administration again, which didn't work last time because we had a credit bubble explosion, and you don't solve a balance sheet great contraction by using the tools of a normal business cycle contraction. And yet that's what we're doing. It's the definition of insanity, using the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Now, we're taking this all... Now, I don't want people to take this the wrong way, that you're saying that Osama bin Laden looked at America and said, because of Material Girl, because of yuppies, we're going to go and knock a couple towers out.
But the interesting thing
is... You're doing this big picture.
Well, yeah, but here's the interesting thing, and this is not going to make people happy, is Wahhabism, I mean, that ideology of radical Islam, they believed that we were weak. That is why they attacked us.
Sure. Well,
and
we were weak because we did not respond to their previous attacks.
Right, but my case would be, even though their way of expressing where the weakness came from is wrong, their diagnosis was correct.
Okay.
We were weak, and my struggle is I still feel we are weak. And see, one of the more troubling things right now is, in the midst of all these superficial solutions, there is an increasing sense under the surface of more and more people that America's lost its way, that America might not be as great as it once was, that the future possibilities are not as great as they once were. And that sense of disease and unease is turning into a form of malaise that I think really calls into question a lot of the early solutions in the post 9/11 era to some of the problems that we were actually facing that we didn't face up to at the time. And we could have. We need a national energy policy. How can we be the world's great superpower and one of the most advanced countries in the world and not have a coherent energy policy? It's just one example of the kind of thing that makes you want to bang your head through the wall. How can we have a tax code that basically does nothing but fund accountants and tax lawyers because it's so complex, not even the IRS in many cases can understand it? These are ludicrous things, and yet they sit there and they're not being changed. In fact, they're being perpetuated.
I have to agree with you that our course has not changed. The Titanic that we're on is still going towards the iceberg. What are your recommendations?
Well, I mean, when you say you have to ask the question who you're focusing on. If you're talking about parish ministry and stuff, I guess what I would say to somebody who's viewing this is the real power doesn't lie where you think it lies in terms of the future that matters. I think the book of Habakkuk is one of the most important books in the Bible for this time. And what Habakkuk is about is where the real spiritual and personal power lies. And see, in the midst of the 80s and the 90s and through 9/11, you know, if you look at all the people that were on the cover of Time and so on and so forth, people like Greenspan and Larry Summers and, you know, the Committee to Save the World, Mother Teresa's not there. But who's the person who's really shaping history? And I think a lot of people in their own individual local settings now can make a real difference for the sake of things that matter by focusing on sacrificing for really significant, eternally significant causes.
Well, I do agree now that you do have the most interesting perspective that I've recorded now for the 9/11 memorial series. And it's going to leave a lot of people questioning. Are they allowed to contact you by email and say, "What are you talking about?"
Well, they're probably not going to be very happy.
Okay.
That's fine. I mean, I just think we've had a big crisis that's had superficial solutions,
Hmm.
and we need deeper solutions, and we need deep repentance, and I haven't seen it.
No.
And if I've seen it and I'm wrong, people can tell me that.
Well,
But
when we were talking earlier, you said that I probably wouldn't agree with you. Actually, I do agree that our course has not changed. Um,
Yeah.
you know, in that we were found in a weak spot, and the people who attacked us build very successfully off weakness. And they take over the countries they've taken over in Afghanistan and Pakistan and other places because they are currently weak. And we're going to have to see what happens. And we certainly have hope in an unshaking God for the future. You know. Well, I want to thank you for your time. And,
oh, sure.
certainly, this will be an interesting topic for at least 2 or 3 weeks. I assure you on Titus 1:9. Let me,